Dzień dobry. Good morning. My name is Kristian Hellesund. I'm a Norwegian comics journalist and I'm also a Norwegian comics historian. And with me today is Gravett. Would you say a little bit about yourself, Paul?
Yeah. Thank you, Kristian. Yes, I'm Paul Gravett. I'm from London and I'm a curator of comics exhibitions. I've also written several books about comics, including manga. And I am also a geek for hire. I'm a nerd, basically, and I want to learn everything about comics from all over the world. So I'm omnivorous.
What I've been doing the last few years is that I've been working on a book on Norwegian comics history. And when we work on Norwegian comics history, we also see traits of other countries' comics history. And what we're going to do now is something I've been really looking forward to, is to actually show some of my finds with Paul. We're going to discuss them because a lot of what we're going to go through now has to do with general comics history. So what you will see is that we're going to talk a little bit about comics history. We're going to talk about definitions. We have to see a little bit on early American newspaper comics, and then we get to the main thing here. We're going to talk about publications of American comics in Northern Europe. So, let's start with the beginning. When is really the start of comics history? Do we talk about the cave paintings in Lascaux, France, 15 to 16,000 years ago, or?
Well, there are not very many speech balloons, are there, in cave paintings? Not that we've found so far. But there's clearly something here because our earliest ancestors wanted to represent what they saw and what they imagined, we think as well, in drawings, and in incredibly good drawings, actually. They're as good as anything we've done since, in my opinion. Have you ever seen cave paintings in real life? Have you seen them?
Yeah.
I had a chance to see the Lascaux paintings years ago when I was a student, and they are amazing. There is a language going on here, though. We don't really understand, of course, what these paintings were doing, whether they were some kind of ritual device, whether they were actually a record of how you would hunt animals. Just recently, I've been reading in New Scientist, they've been discovering that, and maybe not on this case, but there are sometimes little circles, different numbers of circles, next to the animals. And some researchers have suggested, it's being debated now, that the circles represent full moons, which means that our ancestors were thinking about time, and that, I can't quite remember what the moon, but in other words, moons represent a passage of time, because it's a cycle of the full moon, and a certain number of cycles of the full moon meant that this was the right time to hunt the animals, or was the cycle of their life, in other words. So these are not just drawings. They were possibly some other kind of mnemonic or system for working out how to hunt animals and when to hunt them. So that's intriguing, I think.
And if we go on, the Egyptians had their own language with hieroglyphs. And are these comics?
What do you think? I'll put it back to you, Kristian.
In a way, because
they aren't narrating, they aren't telling.
There are narratives because every picture here is a showing of something in the world. So there are a page or a wall with hieroglyphs is actually a story in buildings, in pictures.
Yeah, and in many ways hieroglyphs relate to other languages. One has to think of Japanese and Chinese lettering, for example, whereas you may know a lot of the character forms begin as drawings. So the word for man was originally a character that looked like a man and then became the letter. And you may know our own alphabet has got aspects of image within our regular Roman alphabet that we use every day. So drawing and writing are kind of interwoven and connected. They're not necessarily separate. And this, I think, is part of what comics do as well, is that they are a narrative language that happens to use pictures and words in combination. Yeah.
In Norway, we have a lot of petroglyphs.
So what are these? I don't know what these are. That means you said they're in rock.
Yeah, they're in rock.
They're carved.
They're carved in rocks.
Okay.
And normally, it's just like the cave paintings of Lascaux, they tell a story.
So how old are these?
These are the early Stone Age, so 2,500, 3,000 years ago. So I think they are fascinating because they are to be combined or compared with cave paintings, but they are different. And I don't know if there are so many known of these outside of Scandinavia.
And has anyone suggested what they mean, beyond being representations perhaps of animals? Do we know if they had any ritual use or symbolic use?
We're not sure, but we believe they have a kind of symbolic use. Perhaps it was the local priests who made sure that these were made. But I think these are very interesting because they tell a story. They're of course not in sequence, but every petroglyph has a story.
And we have to imagine that just as the same way that we sit in cinemas sometimes with flickering movies on a big screen, well, back in our ancient ancestors were sitting in caves, darkened rooms, with torches lighting up paintings or petroglyphs. And so basically nothing's changed very much, really. We're still fascinated by sitting in the dark and looking at strange stories. Yeah.
Absolutely. This is also from Norway. It's called the Hellesund carpet. It's 2 of 12 enactments of the months of the year.
Beautiful.
It's from 1150. It can be compared in a way to other church painting, church cards from the time, but it's beautiful.
Absolutely, yeah. And do we know what each of these carpets is representing? Is it representing a cycle or different saints or something?
This is the month of March and the month of April.
Yeah.
On the month of March, you can see that there are a lot of birds, so it's the time for the birds coming back after the winter. And on the next one, there is a medieval soldier going out into the world. And it's a funny thing because this is actually one of the first presentations of a shield with a mark, which was not so typical for Norway, because we didn't have that much noblemen.
Right, oh, very interesting. And then there are carpets, are they on the floor?
No, this was hanging on.
So it's more like a tapestry?
Yeah.
Tapestry, right, okay, yeah. Because there certainly are plenty of historic tapestries which are narrative as well, yeah. The tricky thing with these is how to read them. I mean, just not to go into too long about all this ancient history, but just recently I was involved with the British Museum when they had a big manga exhibition in 2019, and they asked me if I'd like to do something as an event. And I said, well, this isn't the first time you brought comics, as in Japanese comics, into the museum. You have comics, or things like comics like this, on the walls all around you. And is there a way of perhaps getting the experts together from these different specialist historical fields to talk about this narrative art that exists, which is storytelling in pictures? And so I was able to get quite a few important people together to talk about things like, for example, they have a very famous Abyssinian relief of a lion hunt. And when you go to the British Museum, you can get a little app thing of some sort on your mobile, which will then light up the carved reliefs and explain the story. Because that's the main problem. We look at these things and go, right, but I can't read it. I don't understand the story. But if they explain the story to you, then it becomes clear that it is definitely sequential and narrative. And so it's quite a lot like a comic.
What's very typical about looking at comics history is that a lot of the things we look at are American things, French-Belgian things. We're not looking at, for instance, the history of comics in Russia.
Exactly.
And this is an example of a lubok that was made in 1760. It's called The Mice Are Burying the Cat, and it's probably about one of the Tsars.
Ah, does it have that other meaning? I see. The cat is the Tsars.
Yeah.
Wow. And which direction is it reading? Is it reading left to right?
We read it left to right, yeah.
Okay. And it's clearly got, has it got speech balloons, or how does the text work? Do we know how the text works here?
I'm not sure.
No.
The speech balloons, but it's at least a combination of text and pictures. So this is an early comic.
Definitely. And we don't really think of Russia as having such a rich history of comics, even in the present day, so much, but certainly historically. And that's a beautiful example, yeah.
I was in Russia 10 years ago, and lubok, or lobki as they call it in plural, is fascinating. The Russians know all about it, but we who are outside of Russia, we don't know so much about it.
So when did this continue for a long time? Did it die out at a certain point?
Actually, they did it for centuries.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But in the late 19th century, I guess it stopped.
It stopped there, I see. Right.
And this is something that a lot of people say that is one of the really earliest comics. Rolf Töpfer of Geneva in Switzerland.
Yeah. He's been described as the inventor of comics. Now, it's a bit of a difficult thing to say because there isn't really, I don't think, maybe you agree, there isn't one eureka moment where someone goes, I'm going to invent comics, and then poof, they suddenly appear, because as we've seen, I think they evolve and they've been with us in various forms right back to cave paintings.
They have.
Yeah.
And the fun thing about Rolf Töpfer is that he also made a theoretical work about his comics, or picture stories, or what we should call them.
He was the first geek.
Yeah, absolutely. And he wrote about it.
The thing about Töpfer, as you might know, is that he was a teacher, he was a professor in Geneva, and he was kind of, he made these early comics to amuse his students, but he was embarrassed about them slightly. He felt ashamed, and he didn't get them published, because he felt it would undermine his sort of serious professional image if it was revealed that he was doing all these light, jolly, humorous, satirical cartoons, for example. But what he did is he sent a draft to Goethe, the famous German philosopher, very, very serious chap. Only a year or so before Goethe died, it was a Christmas present. In fact, it got to him at Christmas. Goethe was not necessarily, a barrel of laughs. He wasn't, he wasn't your ordinary comics fan. But he was so enthusiastic about what he saw in the draft that it encouraged Töpfer to go on to publish it. And Goethe said something on the lines that if the author had a better text, in other words, a better story, there would be things that could surpass our imagination, could come out of this art form. In other words, Goethe saw that this medium that Töpfer was developing had enormous potential. And of course Goethe was right. So you can tell people, anyone who criticizes comics, tell them, well, Goethe was the first comics fan. Absolutely. There you go. He knew what they were, how good they were.
Absolutely.
From the beginning.
And there will be a side topic now that has to do with copying. And the first copy I need to show is this one. Because a guy called Julius Kell, he actually copied Töpfer's art from Monsieur Cryptogram.
Yeah.
And it was published like this in Germany, Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark.
Wow.
And this is probably the first comic book released in these countries. This is the Danish.
This is also Julius Kell, is it?
Yeah, this is Kell as well.
Okay.
And it looks like this. And this is shows that it was published in both Denmark and Norway.
Right.
1847, but redrawn.
Yeah. Well, this happened also a bit with Töpfer when his work got translated into English. There was a very complicated process there as well. In fact, it was pirated, and it was, in fact, one of the first comic book published in America as a comic book was a supplement of a newspaper, a satirical magazine, cartoon magazine, that collected Töpfer's story into English. Yeah.
But we mustn't forget your country.
Well, you could go back a bit earlier. You haven't put in William Hogarth.
Hogarth, Rowlandson.
Gilray, and many, many others. Yeah, we had an amazing period of satirical prints and sequential material. The word progress is another early word for comics. Comics told in sequence, and sometimes with, not so much with blues, but certainly with text. But yeah, Alice Sloper was a phenomenon. In fact, when he had his own magazine, started in 1874, called Alice Sloper's Half Holiday. That's because, unlike only 2 years or so before in Britain, workers were allowed to have Saturday morning, if not all of those, just half a day, Saturday afternoon off for the first time. You had to work in the morning, but had afternoon off. So Alice Sloper's Half Holiday referred to this time when finally regular people, not the lords and the ladies, could have time off. And his magazine became one of the biggest selling cartoon magazines in the world at this time. And he was merchandised, there were animations, performances, films, lost films sadly, but there were live action films made, very alarming ones with huge masks on of characters portraying Sloper and the other cast of characters. And interestingly, it was drawn by a woman. There aren't many women making comics this early on. Marie Duval was her pen name, and she was actually from French background, but she was based in London, born in London, and it ran for quite a long time. So an important early comic in Britain.
And also an important thing is that we have a main character continuing week after week after week.
Yeah, right, recurring characters. That's not necessarily got to happen in a comic, obviously, but it does help. And he became so popular that he was featured, as I say, in his own magazine, and was loved by everybody because he was the ordinary man who could talk to royalty and celebrities, but also to everyday people.
A lot of people say that the Yellow Kid was the first comic character, but it started out like this in, as what I call it, a drawing with intricate details, but always a large amount of texts.
Right, you've got a lot of text in the drawing, and I think, can we see, Yellow Kid is there, maybe you can make him out. He's just...
I don't think, he's in the middle of the drawing.
He wears a yellow shirt, pretty much in the middle you can see. And there's also, of course, text at the top, isn't it? The typeset text is a kind of narration as well, so it's got a whole mix of what's going on in the page.
But this was only the beginning, but suddenly we have things like this.
Yeah.
With also speech balloons, and of course the Yellow Kid talks through his night going.
Yeah, we get a speech balloon from the parrot, which you can see in the third panel. Is he saying something? I can't read it from here.
Good shot, he says.
Okay, good shot. So he's actually speaking English. And then the Yellow Kid has the text on his shirt changes. Which we shouldn't pretend that this is the first time that there's ever been a speech balloon, because speech balloons existed well before this in caricature prints and progresses in Britain and elsewhere. In fact, it was already an understood form. So why do you think the Yellow Kid became considered the first comic? And does it deserve to be considered the first comic?
I feel it has to do with the recurring character.
Okay, yeah.
And of course, that when the Americans started writing comics history, they only thought about their own country.
You're quite right. I've left that for you to say. Yes, exactly. In fact, there's a famous congress took place at a comics festival in Lucca. Lucca was the first really big comics specialist festival in Italy. And it began in Bordighera in '66, then went to Lucca in '67. Still going. It's one of the biggest festivals in the world, Lucca Comic and Games. And there was a congress brought together in around, probably around 1983, something like that, I think, to decide, or maybe, anyway, sometime around that time. Yeah, I think so. Because, no, about 93 maybe, or 92, because they were deciding when was the centenary of comics. Now, I mentioned the year because when they were deciding this, because they were looking at 1895 or 96, one of those 2 years anyway, which is when Yellow Kid first used multi-panels and used balloons. And they got together a lot of experts, and everybody signed the same agreement. Yes, we all agree that this is the official year, because of course then they could celebrate the centenary in a year or two's time. So that's why they were doing this. But from Britain, we had Dennis Gifford, who was one of the great, really was the great pioneer British comics historian, and he signed it, but he didn't agree, so he signed his name Ali Sloper. In other words, he thought, I'm going to sign it with the name of the character that predates the Yellow Kid and really could be seen to be the beginning of comics. So he didn't really agree with it. But it did give a chance to celebrate in many countries the centenary of comics.
Absolutely.
Or a centenary of comics in America, perhaps.
And here is, of course, the Castaneda Kids. We are in 1897, and from the start, it's a comic story with recurring characters, except for one brother who disappears very early.
So there were three
brothers in the first strip.
Yeah, okay. No balloons, though.
No. And this is Rudolf Dirks. He was an immigrant from Germany. He also had a younger brother called Gus Dirks, who both actually worked on the Castaneda Kids. When Rudolf Dirks went into the army to serve during the Spanish-American War, his brother was his substitute.
And of course, you wouldn't really have the Castaneda Kids without Max and Moritz from Wilhelmsburg in Germany.
Absolutely.
Oh, here we go, yes.
Because the editor that Rudolf Dirks had at the New York newspaper, he said, could you make a comic based on this? And of course, Dirks being German, that was no problem at all. So here you can see a comparison of Max and Moritz with the Katzenjammer Kids, and you also see the development of the Katzenjammer Kids characters until the 1920s.
I like the way you put them in this image shows them as silhouettes. Because that's, by the way, one of the things, if you're creating a comic character, they've got to work in silhouette. Just think Mickey Mouse or Tintin, and silhouettes. They've got to be so identifiable that you don't have to see who they are in full image. Yeah. There's a reason to mention this as well, that the reason that the Katzenjammer Kids took off, partly, was that there were a lot of German immigrants, weren't there, in New York. And they also maybe weren't terribly good at English. So in a way, the comic pages, like Katzenjammer Kids, for example, were a way to kind of gently learn some English, or also laugh the way that their German accent is represented in pidgin German.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Rudolf Dirks himself said that what the language they used was just like his family talked in America. Okay, let's go over to a little bit more boring stuff, because we need to talk about definitions.
Do we?
Yeah, we need to talk
I don't know
a little
about
bit
that.
about
Okay.
it. One year I was here in Łódź. I talked to Scott McCloud, and he's done important theorist work in comics, and I'm a big fan of his comics definition, which is this one. Comics, used with a singular verb, juxtapose pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or to produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. And also like that comment on the definition in this comic panel.
Mm-hmm.
I admit this is the sort of thing that doesn't come up a lot in casual conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely defining comics is a very difficult thing to do in the end, because as soon as you start defining it, then something else comes along that doesn't fit. But there have been previous definitions which I think have proved faulty. The idea there has to be a recurring character, that certainly isn't necessary. We know there are plenty of comics where there are one-off stories. And there are other aspects. Certainly blooms should not be a defining form. I don't think that... You can have comics without blooms, you can have comics without words. So clearly that's not one either. I think Scott's deliberately kept that last bit to produce an aesthetic response. That's as vague as you could get in a way, isn't it? It's not saying to make you laugh or to make you frightened or whatever. But obviously there's something to be communicated in a comic. But do you agree with this definition?
I like this definition,
yeah.
But I feel it could be used in a smaller, more compressed version. So I'm a fan of Morten Harper's definition, which is not widely known outside Norway. In translation into English, it's something like, comics are pictures in sequence with or without text. Scott McCloud liked it and said something that is a good everyday definition he could use himself. How do you feel about that?
Well, it is quite a good one, because I personally prefer the definition to be as indefinite as possible. I think I want an indefinition of comics, because as we've looked, some of the stuff we've gone right back to cave paintings, there are relations to comics. And I was thinking about this morning, that the way that comics are changing now, if you've looked in the big hall here at some of the graphic novels that are coming out, they are very complicated. They're not just the usual panel, balloon, comic. Sometimes they'll include graphics and text or journals or bits of the internet or emails, and in other words, the graphic novel form has just kind of almost gone back to before comics, and so we can use all this other visual and verbal stuff and bring it together. And as we know, manga has also completely transformed the language of comics. It's brought lots of new techniques, lots of new approaches that haven't been used before. And I always think that at the moment I've just co-curated an exhibition that's opening in a month in Paris at the Centre Pompidou for Posy Simmons. Now, I'm not sure how well known she is in Poland, but she's an enormously successful artist in the newspapers, in The Guardian, in the UK. And when her graphic novel, Gemma Bovary, you may have heard of, was first published in France, the French critics there said, this is not bande dessinée, this is a roman illustré, as an illustrated novel, because she's incorporating quite a lot of passages of text, and she uses single images sometimes, which are not balloons, and that's because partly she comes from a background working in newspapers, she also loves literature, and because she understands that there are readers for whom comics are a difficult language. and to have endless pictures, blues. Actually, some people like a little bit of like an island to rest, an island of text to read. And also Posey uses this technique because simply sometimes text is just more efficient. You take more time, more space, more panels to explain something that you can say in a sentence. So it seems to me that she, and she's not alone in this, is actually developing the sort of verbal, visual hybridity, whatever that means, hybridity of comics in an exciting way. And that's why, and her work doesn't really entirely fit these definitions. She's stretching it and pushing it. And I don't think we should be afraid of text. I have a feeling that some people in the audience here are quite comfortable reading text without pictures. And if it's merged and mixed in with comics, it actually makes the art form even more rich and potential.
Absolutely, I completely agree on you. One of the last good reading experience I had was Heimat, a German book.
Nora Krug.
Yeah.
Amazing.
She uses all these things. She blends text. She blends text with a lot of pictures and photos and everything.
Yeah, some of the things she found in the archives about her family and their involvement with the Nazis and with fascism. Yeah, very important book. Yeah.
So that's very good. What I was going to was this one. This is something that most of you are not able to read. It's taken from the book Tegneseriehistoria, the History of Comics by Øyvind Hoel and Thor Strand-Olsen, only released in Norway. If you look at the down on the left, on the lower part here, there is this character with a question mark. He says that when it comes to definition, it's boring. Everybody knows what a comic book is.
Mm-hmm. Without having to be told.
Because it's tacit knowledge.
Mm. Yes. Do you agree with that?
In a way, yes. Because I feel that this is a comic, and this is a comic, and this is a comic, and sometimes I can't explain it.
No, right, quite right. I think historically, though, we haven't shown all the historical examples, but there are some where you go, well, is this or is this not? Is there too much text? Is there too... That still becomes a question, I think. But that's an interesting point. Yeah, it is almost something you know just by seeing it. Mm. Yeah.
So in a way, I would say that their definition would be everybody knows what a comic is when they see it.
Right. That's a consensus view, isn't it? A consensus definition.
In my work, I also use the definition. In addition to agreeing with the basics and the definitions made by MacLeod and Harper, I feel it is necessary to use the demarcation line in time. In music history and literature history, you can see that there are demarcation lines where a period starts and a period ends. Of course, these lines are not definite. You need to have a slack, because Baroque music was made after Bach died, and you will find traits of Baroque music before Bach started composing music. And to add to any comics definition, I would like to say that modern comics started with the American newspaper comics in the 1890s. But, and I need to say that this has to do with Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn is known for his theoretical works with the topic paradigms. One of the main things about paradigms is that everybody knows they are working within a specific paradigm of science or art or whatever. I feel that we cannot say that before Rudolf Dirks created the Katzenjammer-Kids, we didn't have a paradigm of comics. Therefore, I set the demarcation line around 1898 or 1897, together with Dirks' creation of Hans and Fritz, and call it the start of modern comics. Not comics, but modern comics.
That's a way of distinguishing between what came before and what we know more familiarly. I think you're right, yeah. That's the way of taking it. I do feel, though, that I'm afraid that the Americans, and I'm not anti-American, but we love the Americans, but they do want to claim a lot for themselves, and I think if you look around, there are things before, and there are other people making comics at the same time. And you're right to say there's not a clear-cut point where it changes. Yeah, it's a transition.
Yeah, and what we can say that is that Töpfer, Rolandson, and any person working with traits of comics, they were not making comics. They were not involved in modern comics. Instead, they are parts of comics history. They made proto-comics. How do you feel about such a distinction?
Yeah, I think my only slight concern about that is if we then consign them to some idea that they were slightly less advanced or a bit kind of primitive. And as I've said, Project Sim is an example where someone can actually go back to some of their techniques and bring them forward, and actually they are still relevant. And I think also, I suppose more generally, I like the idea that we don't define comics at all. I don't think we really need to. I mean, people like Eddie Campbell has actually played with this by trying to by deliberately not defining what the graphic novel is, because as we've been saying, the graphic novel is wide open. It can include almost any visual and verbal combination you could imagine. And by having that openness, the art form is more alive, I believe. And I think there is an agenda here, because as we are going to be discussing, America was very, very determined that the world would read their comics. As you may know, they had very powerful newspaper syndicates, and they exported their characters internationally. So it's in their agenda, in a way, and it's a business model, which they're still using today, of course, to dominate world popular culture. And the only thing that's been able to really fight back, and it is a war, I mean, it may not seem that way, but it is a cultural war, it is Japan. Japan, without really even trying to compete, because Japan had no interest in exporting its comics that much, really. It was mostly, had such a huge home market already, but because it's being picked up by the West, as an alternative, as a refreshing alternative to the American approaches to comics and animation, it's become, of course, phenomenal. I'm seeing tons of it here at the festival. So manga is a force to be reckoned with, and the Japanese origins of comics are also tied up with American comics, because they didn't really develop until they also absorbed the influence of the American strips. Much too much.
No problem. The American newspaper comics were a big hit, and the readers were, as you told us earlier, in part immigrants, and the Sunday papers were the big entertainment for families on their day off. The color supplements had odds, and the readers did not have to be perfectly fluent in English to enjoy them. This was also before cinemas and radios. How important do you feel the Sunday supplements were for American families in the early 20th century?
I think you and I agree this is an extraordinary moment. There is nothing else like this on the planet. Whatever we may say about America, the fact is they had the best printing presses, which, by the way, they bought from France, because we should not forget that the French had the best printing presses for colour, and it was an American, a Chicago businessman who discovered the presses in Paris, printing cheap colour comics. Actually, there were comics which we haven't talked about, and they are part of it, which he then said, right, I'm going to buy this machine, get it back over to America, and we'll pump out full-colour comics cheaply. And you have to remember, they were free, so they're free with your newspaper. So you bought a newspaper, and you got this lovely big colour section. And for comic artists, just imagine having this big space to fill once a week with your own comic in one page, and you've got colour, incredible colour. In fact, the kind of colour printing that we don't even know how to do properly now, because it has such skilled specialists and engravers to make the colours, and the artists were in charge of their colouring. They would actually instruct them, and they had a free reign, pretty much. The form hadn't been defined, so they were incredibly inventive things like Winsor McKay and George Herriman, taking the art form into incredible new territory.
Absolutely. And as you can see here, the newspapers of the early 20th century were huge compared to today's tabloid newspaper and ordinary comic books. Here you can see...
That gives you the scale, doesn't it, there? Yeah.
Yeah, I've used the scale here. I've taken a picture of the original size, together with a Batman trade paperback, and of course got McCloud's Understanding Comics.
Well, it's worth mentioning here, by the way, that the reason, if you ever wondered why American comics are the size they are, is because the very first people to publish them used the newspaper presses, the colour printing, of course, and just folded them in half, and folded them in half again. So a 16-page supplement became a 64-page comic book, and they put the wrapper on the outside of it. And that's exactly why the comic is the size it is. All what happened, of course, is that in America, it shrunk from 64 pages down to 32 for about $5 or something now. Whereas the Japanese, they didn't bother with colour, but they used the same format, the same approach of folded newspaper down to that size. But they just kept adding pages and have had thicker and thicker manga magazines.
I think it's just fascinating when you get to see these newspaper pages on the road. There was an exhibition in Dortmund in Germany earlier this year, and also in Munich, which both had American newspaper comics, and you also can see some of the originals. And imagine you have a full-scale newspaper comic, newspaper page as the printed version, but the original was even bigger.
Even bigger. In fact, the biggest book I have in my collection is big enough to be a coffee table. No, it's not a coffee table. It even has a wooden cover, and it's a collection. It's a edition of original pages of around maybe 40 of them of the Little Nemo and Slumberland originals, printed full size. As you said, they are enormous, enormous works.
So basically, most of the times when you see these comics reprinted, they are in the wrong size. And in a way, it's not a good thing to represent the comics how they should look.
Unfortunately, people like Peter Maresca at Sunday Press Comics has innovated and managed to find printers who can print these Sunday pages full size, so you can experience them the way that people did at the time, and they are astonishing.
Okay, we should take a look at some of these pioneers.
People read them, by the way. People read them. Kids read the Sunday pages on the floor because they were so big. You just lie down on your stomach on a Sunday morning and look at and just literally kind of fall into the comics on the page. They were that big.
This is a funny thing. This is an early jam session where Frederick Upper, James Swinnerton, Rudolf Dirks and his brother Gus Dirks cooperate.
Look at that, photos across the top.
Yes.
These cartoonists were celebrities.
Yeah,
and they were wealthy.
Absolutely. Rudolf Dirks' son, John Dirks, he grew up also as an artist, and he also overtook his father's work. But he was among the richer people when he went to private school.
Well, these artists were very successful. I mean, they got paid well by the syndicates, and they were celebrities. They were their characters and their photographs as well would appear on adverts endorsing products. They were the celebrities of their time, as big as any sportsman or movie stars, or in fact, before movie stars in a sense. I mean, obviously they were silent cinema. Yeah.
Of course, Outcourt was a big success with the Yellow Kid, but he also earned a lot of money from merchandising.
Yeah. I mean, the way we have all the manga merchandise or Simpsons or Batman merchandise, that's nothing new. It goes back to the beginning. I mentioned Alice Stoker had merchandising as well of all kinds. Yeah.
Outcourt, he had a background working for Thomas Edison's company. He did drawings for them. He also done a lot of illustration works, and the Yellow Kid, I think, is very talented work, but of course this is not the best example. I think when he did Buster Brown, which we're going to take a look at later, he did a better work. Of course, Rudolf Dirks is a more crude artist. He is very good at showing traits from the comics. For instance, he uses speed lines to show movement. He also shows stars and to show that some people are hurt. He can use Zs to show that somebody is sleeping and so on.
Yeah, some of these techniques that we think of as special to comics. You know, you have the words, you have the pictures. We also have these things which are called emanata. And they are the strange things you've just been describing, which are symbols, I suppose you would say, of emotions or actions. They did pre-exist, even in Töpfer's work. There are examples of these, aren't there, which were developed early on. Yeah.
And then we have Upper, who did several comics. One of them was Happy Hooligan, which of course is before Charlie Chaplin did his character.
Absolutely. We do know actually that Charlie Chaplin, British of course, a comedian, he was inspired by British comics for his tramp character. There were already tramps. Willy Willy and Tired Tim, they were tramp characters in British comics, and we know that Chaplin partly took his inspiration from those to perform it, and make his own stage act. We're doing all right.
Yeah, and of course there is, and the name was Maud, also by Upper, about this mule who kicks everybody.
Yeah, fantastic colouring. I mean, beautiful, subtle colouring on that. Very good.
There's an example of Swinnerton's work.
But he's an underrated early pioneer, isn't he, with Little Jimmy? Yeah, very important.
And one who is not underrated is, of course, Winsor McCay.
Wow.
His artwork is just fantastic.
One of the things you'll notice he does, of course, is that he's one of the first people, I think, one of the first to vary the layout of the page, the size of the panels. What you've been seeing up until now, mostly in these Sunday strips, is kind of panel, 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 all the same size, like a little stage set. In many ways, it's like looking from an audience up onto a stage. But here, McKay stretches the panels to suit what the storytelling is needing, and of course creates extraordinary, surreal imagery. This and the other series he made, which was called Dreams of the Rabbit Fiend, which was a very dark, scary strip in black and white, where the person wakes up at the end, like Nemo, it was just a dream or just a nightmare. Both of these strips, in many ways, anticipate surrealism. We actually know that there are connections between Rabbit Fiend and some Nemo pages as well, and some of the early work, for example, by Buñuel and Dali in their famous films. We know they must have seen it. There's no doubt about it. Yeah.
And you also see,
yeah. The other interesting thing about this is if you look at the bottom sequence here, where the bed is walking along, can you see that there actually is a panel where two are joined up and it crosses over? It's panels 3 and 4 across the bottom. There's a whole moon in the background, but that's divided by a panel break. That might not seem very important to you at all, but actually it's the idea that you can have a sequence that runs across the same background, and that is, again, a pretty new technique that McKay invented. There's an interesting just background on this, is that the reason McKay was doing this, why would you spend most of your life drawing comics about a little boy who goes into a dream world and comes back to family realities and safe and sound in his bed, or other people eating a cheese sandwich or Welsh rarebit at night and having nightmares, but again, waking up and they're all right. Well, McKay had a brother, forgive me, I can't remember, maybe possibly an older or younger brother, who had mental problems. And in those days, if you had mental problems, you went into an asylum, whether you were mad or not. And this is something that was a fear, undoubtedly, I think, in the McKay family and amongst Winston McKay himself, in his own mind, that he might be suffering from something similar. So for him to continually reaffirm in these comics that I can step into this mad world of dreams and nightmares and come out of it and all right at the end, I wake up and I'm okay, this has, to me anyway, seems an extra symbolic meaning. It was meaningful to him to do these comics.
We have to rush on a little bit here now. This is Outcourt in a presentation in an early newspaper. He has made an autobiographical drawing, and you also see some of his other characters, not only the Yellow Kid, but also Buster Brown.
And also Little Moses, who of course is definitely not PC and definitely not the right portrayal of a black person now. No.
A lot of people say that the first comic book was famous families during the 1930s, but there were books like these presenting Buster Brown, Cat Stemmer Kids, already in the early noughts.
Yes, and these are lovely big books which took the Sunday pages and basically cut them in half and printed them into 2.5 pages. They're fabulous, aren't they?
Yeah, I think they're very fabulous. I've seen some of them, and the printing is just gorgeous, and of course the colours also drive them forward.
These are definitely important early examples of comics. Yeah.
Some of these books also had European versions, and here's a Buster Brown published in Denmark that was distributed in both Denmark and Norway. And as you can see, they've kept the bubbles, they've kept the drawings, and they've kept the original coloring.
Lovely.
So, let's move on to this one. This is Illustreret Familiejournal in Denmark from 1909. You can see Buster Brown, you can see the Yellow Kid, but something's happened here. Do you believe this was Outcourt's artwork?
Well, I am puzzled by it. Did Buster Brown and the Yellow Kid meet?
Yeah, once.
This is the meeting?
Yeah.
So it's not a made-up story, okay.
No.
But certainly, of course, the fact that all the balloons have been removed, you've got text underneath in typesetting, that's a big difference.
Yeah, so this is a way that was often used in Europe, where they did redrawings of original artwork. But we'll show you, also from Denmark, this drawing is Cat Stemmer Kids in 1903 in the Ekstrabladet newspaper. And this is based on this drawing by Rudolf Dirks, published a year earlier. And as you can see, first of all, of course, this is in black and white. but
they've taken all the balloons out.
Yeah, and they've also taken away the speech balloons.
Mm-hmm.
And I said earlier that Dirk's artwork is a bit crude, but I feel it's cruder seeing the redrawings. Let's take a look at this one. Sorry, let's take a look at this one.
Mm-hmm.
This is published in Norway in 1909, 4 years later than the original by Dirks, which look like this.
Yeah. Well, I think we know that there's something different, isn't it? When we have balloons inside the panels, the characters come alive, don't they? I mean, and for a long time, this was the way that people read comics in other countries. Why do you think there was this resistance to using the original balloons?
I think it has to do with a lot of people feeling that comics were not real literature, but by making
proper reading.
Yes, but putting the text underneath the picture, you suddenly have picture stories, which are much more, let's call it, elevated reading.
Yeah. See, that's certainly a reason. Is there also maybe just a practical matter of how do you re-letter these balloons? You've got to translate them, you've got to fit the text inside them. I wonder whether it's easier just to kind of remove them, and then, would that be a reason they changed?
It could be a reason,
yeah.
Absolutely. One of the things that intrigues me by this way of doing it is that a lot of information that's not in the picture will be found in the text. So, for instance, where...
Extra information.
Yeah. We can find another example from here. We can find the example here. You can see that there is very little text underneath the pictures here, and the speech bubbles are often very short. So basically, they make more details to every picture.
Sure, that's great, got much more narration. Yeah.
This is the first Kristian's book published in Denmark and Norway in 1911, which is actually something that annually are existing today. I actually wrote the introduction to this year's Norwegian Kristian's book.
That is one of the most amazing things about Norway, that are the Christmas annuals that come out in this same traditional format.
Yes.
Always a century later, more than a century later.
At that time it was 16 pages, these days they are 32. And as you can see, this is the drawing that the front picture was based on.
So is the front picture made by a Norwegian artist?
I think it's made by a Danish artist.
Danish.
Yeah, but I don't know who. And here are examples from inside the book, together with the original artwork by Rudolf Dirks.
So, so why are the pictures different here? They've been redrawn at the bottom.
Yeah.
They've been completely redrawn.
Completely redrawn.
Wow.
Here is another example. They even mirrored one of the drawings.
They have done it back to front, haven't they?
Yeah.
How peculiar.
Absolutely. And there are lots of details in the text that is not in the second picture.
No. But of course, this actually relates to what happened in Britain. In British comics, we had a lot of text beneath our panels as late as the 1950s, and a lot of the time you didn't need to read all this text underneath, typeset text. You could read the balloons and get the story completely. So it's there we have both. We have the text beneath and the balloons.
And of course, this is an example of a
German going back to the 1890s maybe.
And this is in a way my proof that reading picture stories are much more elevated literature than just reading comics.
These were definitely done for educating kids, as you say. They were meant to be good for you, basically.
This is Snow White from 1878, I believe.
Yep.
Okay, this is Happy Hooligan in a redrawing made for Scandinavia.
Gosh.
And this is Oppa's original art.
Gosh, what a transformation. You had to go from, Wow, I wonder if the Americans just gave the rights to do this and then do what you want with it. You know, it's totally transformed.
I have a hypothesis for this. Because Denmark did not sign the Berne Convention, which made it possible for Danish publishers to use stuff from outside Denmark without having to pay royalties.
Oh, that would be a way. Yeah, because they avoided copyright, of course. Yes.
So I believe that a lot of these early works that were made for Denmark, that was also distributed in the rest of Scandinavia, they were redrawn because it was cheaper doing that, because they didn't have to bother about the Berne Convention than buy the original from the Hirsch.
And they're redrawing the drawings, is that right as well? They're redrawing them. Yeah. So they just thought they wouldn't get noticed. No, I see.
It's a hypothesis.
Yeah, so this is not quite the syndication the Americans wanted.
No, absolutely not.
There's no money coming in.
This is, and the name was Maud. Of course, in Norway, for some reason, Maud became a male.
Okay.
So he's called Peter As, which would mean Peter Eisen. Yeah. And here's the original.
Yeah.
And you can see, this is crude.
Very simplified, isn't it? Yeah, very crudely done. Yeah.
And here is a funny thing as well. This is one of the characters from, and the name was Maud, who was out chasing whales.
As you do.
Yeah, as you do. But when I look through old comics, I find the same situation in a Customer Kid story.
Right. So they've copied one and made it into another character.
Yes.
That is very peculiar. Yeah.
I found another example as well.
Well, they must have had access to these American comics. They must have been reaching.
I believe that they had people picking up newspapers in New York.
And sending them over.
Yes.
Right. I see. Yeah.
But look here. It is one of the characters in her name was Maud, who is out here with his wife, and they're on a swing. And when I look at the originals, it was not the same characters. It was Happy Hooligan and his nephews.
Right. So it doesn't matter which character it is, you can change it to something else.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is very peculiar, because when I read the old comics history in Norway, they often use pictures like this to show, okay, this is how the old comics look like. No, they didn't look like this, but it was printed this way in Scandinavia.
Yes. This isn't unique to Scandinavia, though, is it? Do you think? I'm thinking like
no, I don't.
This amount of changing and reworking.
Yeah,
is it special to them?
I think they did it in other countries as well, but I don't have an overview, and this is one of the things that I want comics historians to meet and discuss.
Definitely.
I'm sure that if I sit down with a Hungarian or a Czech or a German
or a Polish historian,
we'll find examples.
You will.
That this was done also in other countries. This is original artwork by George McManus, translated into Norwegian. Another magazine used the same story, redrew everything, but take a look at the main character here. Here he looks like a George McManus character. Yeah. Here he doesn't.
No, they changed it, haven't they?
Yeah.
And have you found the McManus story it comes from?
No, I haven't found the original, but it's the Newlyweds.
Like exactly, Newlyweds, yeah.
And when we're into George McManus, here he is from Bringing Up Father, together with the version published in Scandinavia.
Strip, yeah.
But look on the top right, top hand, you can see there, copyrighted for Scandinavia, it says. So probably they had a possibility to buy a license here, but they still did redrawings.
It has to be said that of all the American comic strips that had an impact around the world, it would be McManus, Bringing Up Father, had by far the biggest. He was one of the big sparks for manga, and the King of Persia so loved Bringing Up Father that he made a Persian carpet of the characters as a gift and sent it to McManus. It's just incredible. Yeah, so it was a global phenomenon.
We have 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. So, I'll give it to you.
I will show you, this is Mr. Hubby, a very known comic made by Steiningens. But when I was in Malmö at the comics library, comics museum, comics archive there last year, I found an original artwork made for printing based on the same comics that show that at least some of these comics were made in Sweden.
How interesting. Yeah.
So this is...
with balloons.
Yeah. With balloons here. And of course, we have to see this.
This is incredible, isn't it?
Yeah. But look now, this is from the Danish and Norwegian magazine Ollers. And if you look at it, you feel, okay, this is an extremely good example of Winsor McCay's artwork. Look now.
That's where it comes from.
That's the original.
And what have they done in this other version? They made it. Is it the same story?
It's the same story.
Okay.
Of course, they have taken away the balloons,
yeah,
and they put the text beneath. And of course, the artist who's redrawn this have made the panels narrower.
Right. Very intriguing.
It's very intriguing. And here you can see another example. As you can see, the redrawings are very accurate, but at the same time, for instance, losing the speech bubble in the last panel there makes the equilibrium of the panel wrong.
Surely, yeah, and it means it has to all be in. Looks like these look like they're in rhyming couplets underneath. Are they in poetry? Underneath, it looks like in poetry underneath.
Yes, it is poetry.
Yeah, right.
And of course, this is
Castle Alley.
Redrawn for Scandinavia. This is the original by King.
Yeah.
It's accurate, but it's not the same.
No. So at some point, I presume, after this, at some point, there was a transition where they no longer did this, and they did use the originals.
Absolutely. And when I look at comic books until the 1990s, there are some redrawings, but that has to do with formatting, to show that they use the print space correctly. So some redrawings have been done there. You said a little bit about the Norwegian Christmas annuals, because we're allowed to see some of these old comics every year today. I did the introductions for Bring Up Father and Casting My Kids last year. This year, Casting My Kids. There will also be Blondie. There will be Beetle Baby, which is newer, of course. But a lot of these American comics, they still exist every year in Norway. So if you go to Norway, you will find things like these in shops where you can find loads of comics, and some of them are old newspaper comics.
That's beautiful, yeah.
I think we should have another hour.
We'll come back next year.
Yeah.
Do we have any time for any questions or any reactions, or we haven't bored you to tears with all this very geeky stuff? Have we got the front here? That's good.
Yeah. I have a thought, because you're talking about why they redraw the things. Because I'm thinking about the printing techniques that they had at the time, and the lack of photo lithography, for example.
Yes, that would have been a factor.
Yeah, and someone had to redraw it so it's different. In some ways.
It's possible. I just wonder, because the syndicates would want the comics not to be changed, wouldn't they? The American syndicates would surely have provided, if they were doing it officially.
But you have to think about time.
Time, yes, is a fact, of course.
Factor of the control that
and cost.
You don't have a phone
to convert them. No.
So
you have telegraphs or something.
You have to have someone on the side, or just give them the rights.
Yeah.
And they have to.
They do what they want with it.
Yeah. Exactly.
I think you're quite right. That's possibly just the practical side of it. Yeah. Yes, sir.
The same idea, but regarding text. So my idea is that they didn't put text in the notebook because it was too certain that it will come and find printing. So they put the text in a way that they are sure that it will be okay and it will be written.
Yeah.
So they put it the notebook and the text also the written.
Yes.
I just want to add an interesting element to what you said, because this is what exactly happened in Poland in the 30s. But what is interesting, we did not copy American comics, but Scandinavian. And we, in the 30s, there was a lot of example of redrawing Oscar Jakobsen comics or Storm Petersen. So Peter Okpink or Adamson were actually redrawn for Polish newspapers and completely rearranged. So if you're interested, we have a lot of examples at the Comic Museum in Krakow. So I think it forms an interesting chain of inspiration from America to Scandinavia, from Scandinavia to the Middle Europe.
And very interesting, you say Storm Petersen, because he is one of the persons who they believe redraw customer kits for Scandinavia.
Oh, that would make sense. All right. Any last questions? We have one from you, please.
I just want to make one comment, is that very early
Yes, yes.
was because people could read.
Yeah.
So the mainstay Masculinus were people who read, i.e. Seven Stations of the Cross, the history of the church. So it's very early on.
Yeah.
The second is the Bayeux Tapestry.
Yeah, and the Bayeux Tapestry is another very
So
important.
it's telling
Yeah.
the story without
Which, by the way, was not made in Bayeux, but actually was made by women in Britain. Not yeah, come on, I'm not that patriotic. Good. Well, thank you very much for your attention and interest, and thank you for this